Hello, BookTube. I have a reworked tag. It's called the Vintage SF and Fantasy Genre Tag. I adapted this from the Space Possum, and she was inspired in her tag from the Little Red Reviewer, who originated, I think something, it's called Vintage Sci-Fi Month. I don't know if that still occurs or not. But I took it and reworked it a little bit. By vintage, the cutoff date they used was 1979. I guess you can tell my age where the stuff from 1980 seems new to me. So we'll try to keep with that 1979 cutoff date. So the first question is, so they did sci-fi. I'm doing sci-fi and fantasy, and I'm doubling up the questions a little bit. What was the first vintage sci-fi book you ever read? Well, for me, it was this, and I've shown it before. Andre Norton. And it's Daybreak 2250 AD. The original title was Starman's Son. I have an Ace book here, old paperback I've had for years. The copyright's from 1952, so it definitely qualifies for the cutoff date. Fors was a mutant. He did not know what drove him to explore the empty lands to the north, where the great skeleton ruins of the old civilization rusted away in the wreckage of mankind's hopes. But he could not resist the urging that led him through danger and adventure to the place where he faced the menace of the Starmen. So this is what, we had a neighbor, and he had a box of vintage sci-fi down in his basement, and he gave that to me. It also included paperback of the Isaac Asimov's, I think he was writing it Paul French at the time, as Paul French at the time, Lucky Star. So you'd go to each of the planets, and Lucky Star would have an adventure there. I'm trying to think, I think I had Heinlein's Glory Road. Quite a bit that most of you that are into vintage sci-fi would recognize, and I wish I kept the old paperbacks. This is a survivor, I guess, but some of those, and he kept them in immaculate condition, and following him I did too, but I don't remember what happened to him. So what makes this tag a little different is I've also taken the same question and applied it to fantasy. So what was the first vintage fantasy that you ever read? And again, it was a neighbor, a different neighbor. Great guy. He, big bearded, long-haired guy. Very cool. And he tried, when he saw him what I'm reading, he gave me this. And this is the exact cover of the volume he gave me of The Hobbit. And this would have been about 1972, 73 that I read this. And I just went absolutely crazy. So this edition came out, we probably can figure out when I read it, but when it came out. So this printing is from 1973. And it has the introduction by Peter Beagle. Yeah, absolutely loved it to the point where I had to run out and get The Lord of the Rings, and then Farmer Giles of Ham and Smith of Wootton Major. Just searched out everything Tolkien I could find, and back then it was not quite as easy as it is now. I mean, Christopher Tolkien hadn't had his huge publishing run and all that, so just fantastic. What is your favorite vintage science fiction book? Well, for me, that's a hard one. There's so many I've read over the years that I absolutely love, and it seems unfair to come back to the same ones all the time, but the honest answer is Dune. It had a profound, profound impact on me. chapter headings with the quotes, the creation, the world building, the politics, the everything. So this is copyright 1965, which qualifies. This is, you can hear my son upstairs, he's playing video games and yelling. The cover by John Schonher. And this copy we have here is another one of the Ace. So, Dune. And then, what is your favorite vintage fantasy book? Come back to the same old theme, and of course, for me, there actually would be competition in this. This is Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring, which is part 1 of the Lord of the Rings. But there would be competition. I love Michael Moorcock's work, the Elric books. They would be close. Loved, I guess you would call the Tarzan books fantasy. The genre lines start to blur a little bit, and then the competition increases. But there's no doubt that the Lord of the Rings would have to be. You'd have to choose it. It's just unbelievable. So, what is your favorite vintage sci-fi book cover? I may be blurring the lines here because the book definitely qualifies, or books. But I'm not sure when the Michael Whalen cover art came out for Foundation. I probably could have found out. It doesn't matter. I can bend the rules here a little. So for me, I love these. This is Michael Whalen's cover for Foundation books. This is the Foundation trilogy. Here are the end papers on this. This is one of those. Let me see who published this. This includes Foundation, Foundation and Empire, and Second Foundation. The original copyright was 51, 52, and 53. And Del Rey Books. Michael Whalen, like I say, did the art. So, the original trilogy I had was a Book of the Month, Science Fiction Book Club, excuse me. And a lot of you remember this. It was a gray, white, maybe a little darker than gray, somewhat boring cover. So when the Whalen covers came out, I was thrilled to see. I didn't have this originally. I bought the paperbacks later. And yeah, the original Science Fiction Book Club, as much as I loved the Science Fiction Book Club, and I love some of the stuff they did, and I wish I'd kept more of them. The Michael Whalen covers were an improvement. So what is your favorite vintage fantasy cover? And I guess this matters how you define the genre. And this is a Neil Adams cover to Tarzan and the Lion Man. Look at the action. And look at, well, I'm not going to point it out to you. You can tell if you like it on your own. I've recently picked up a whole bunch of these black covers, and I can just sit and look. The black covered Tarzans. I picked up a bunch out of the series. Piles like about that high, and there's more that I don't have, and I'll keep an eye out for them if I can remember which ones I don't have. But this I loved, absolutely loved. So, what vintage sci-fi books are on your TBR? Well, right now on my TBR, I have War of the Worlds, which obviously I've read. I read it years ago. I went through an H.G. Wells phase. Never went through quite as big a Jules Verne phase, and that may be translations I had available. But H.G. Wells, I definitely did it, I think in junior high. And I'd like to find a copy of, I mean, I can get it easy on Project Gutenberg, but I'd like to find a nice little copy to read. I remember some of the old covers and stuff, and because I'd like to get it and reread it before I do that. Steve Donoghue sent me this, and very kind of him. And I've seen a few of you review it and or have chats about it. The Message of The Massacre of Mankind, sequel to The War of the Worlds, Stephen Baxter. And I've heard pretty good things about it, and it's sitting there ready to go as soon as I can reread the original. I'm not sure you have to do that. It's just one of those little projects that I'd like to get done. And which fantasy book is on my TBR? I don't know. A lot of what I'm doing now, this coming year, 2018, is going to be very different for my reading. And a lot of that's BookTube inspired. Over the last 20 or 30 years, I've been reading an awful lot of nonfiction, literary fiction, the occasional genre fiction. But when I first started, of course, it was the genre fiction that pulled me in and that I enjoyed. And I slowed down on reading genre fiction. And there's been so much that I've missed. Really high quality stuff that I've heard about. So I probably will be visiting a lot of science fiction and fantasy this coming year in a very systematic way to catch up and to see what they both have what's happened in the field since about 1979, 1980, when I was really into the heaviest part of my reading in the genre. So there'll be a big focus on that. So how many vintage sci-fi books have you read in the last year? Well, I've started to pick up a little more on the science fiction and a little more on the fantasy. I'm not sure how many qualify as vintage because my focus has changed a little bit. But I just had a buddy read with Ernest Lee Eston, and this book came out originally in '64, and that was Hard to Be a God, Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. Absolutely enjoyed this. This is translated by Elena Makridina. It's a Chicago Review Press book. They came out with theirs in, 2014. They've done a few of the Strugatsky books. I will search down the others. I think there's at least 2 others, and this was a good vintage sci-fi read. A vintage fantasy read I did this year is I went back to try. I never read these in order. I'm not sure I've read every one of them, but I love the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser books. So I went back and got Fritz Leiber's Swords and Deviltry. Let's see, when did this come out? I'm not sure when it was first published, but absolutely great stuff, fun stuff. And then right now I'm reading as a buddy read with Elena Makridina, Dragonflight, which actually is science fiction. Though you would think with dragons it would be fantasy, but it's science fiction. So it's volume 1 of the Dragon Riders of Pern. Just about to finish it up. We're reading each week sections. So there's 4 sections to the book. Let me see here. Where Search, Dragonflight, Dustfall, and The Cold Between. I'm reading Dustfall right now. So if you wanted to jump in and join us, I mean, let's see, there's 305 pages, well, 309 pages. If you want to jump in and join us, it's easy to catch up. We'll be doing this weekend the 3rd part, a little review on the 3rd part. You could probably catch up in a day. I'm really enjoying it. I remembered it being great. There's so many Pern books out there, and you know why, is because people just loved them. I'm actually looking at the back here because we're talking about vintage science fiction and fantasy. Here's a little ad from the back. Let me read some of them to you. Starman Jones by Robert Heinlein. These are Ballantine books, by the way. Norstrilla by Cordwainer Smith. I love Cordwainer Smith's work. Farthest Star, Frederick Pohl and Jack Williamson. A Funeral for the Eyes of Fire by Michael Bishop. The Man Who Awoke by Lawrence Manning. Warm Worlds and Otherwise, James Shipley Jr. with an introduction by Robert Silverberg. More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon. Cycle of Fire by Hal Clement. And The Tar Aim Krang by Alan Dean Foster. Alan Dean Foster is a writer I've always enjoyed. I don't know why he doesn't get more credit. So I'm reading Dragonflight, so that sort of is vintage sci-fi I'm keeping up with. And then, where do you buy science fiction vintage science fiction books and vintage fantasy books? I do a little bit online, not much. Like I say, occasionally I look at Project Gutenberg and download something. But when I go to library book sales, or I go to an old bookshop, used bookshop, or if we got a few thrift stores around here, I just wander around, and they're in good enough condition. I might grab them. I don't buy vintage science fiction or fantasy much from the retail bookstores. If there's a title that I'm not going to find any other way, and there's a nice reprint, I'll do it. I have a lot of old science fiction book club, like omnibus volumes that are nice. A lot of Heinlein that way. A lot of the John Carter of Mars, the Edgar Rice Burroughs I have in those science fiction. The science fiction book club isn't, at least to me, isn't what it used to be, so I don't do much of that anymore. So now it comes down to who do you want to tag. So I'm going to really be interested in hear what Steve Donoghue has to say. He's read a tremendous amount, not surprisingly, of vintage in both genres. Elena Makridina, who I'm doing the Dragonflight read with. Curtis Books and Films. Curtis is a student of science fiction, so I'd be interested to hear what he has to say, especially when you talk about something like Philip K. Dick or something like that. Book reviews from Peg. It wasn't vintage science fiction, but it was written in that manner that I saw her do a book review of, and absolutely loved it. I got to hear it. Avengers of the Moon, a Captain Future novel by Alan Steele. Absolutely enjoyed it. Sirbooksage, Charles, he's a newer channel that I've really found that I enjoy. Is a tremendous knowledge in this area. I saw a little bit of discussion he did on Andre Norton, one of my favorites. It was great. Paperback Junky. I've seen he's done some stuff recently with Edgar Rice Burroughs. That's really good. And then Beck's Books, a channel has been around and that I'm just discovering. And so anybody else who wants to do the tag, that'd be great. Just let me know that you've done it, and I'd love to go watch it. So that was the vintage science fiction and fantasy genre tag. Like I say, it's adapted from the Little Red Reviewers, who originated it, and I first saw it on the Space Possum. So thank you, BookTube.